Hi everyone! So in this video, we're going to be talking about shutter speed. So let's get to it. So shutter speed can also be referred to as exposure time, and it's how long the shutter in a camera is open. So let me show you real quick. So on this camera, now this is an old camera, it already has some issues, so don't do this with your camera. If we look inside here, you can see there's like a mirror thing, and that mirror is on the shutter, and it is actually taking what's coming in through the lens and then bouncing it around in here so that we can see what's going on with the viewfinder. Now when you take a photo though, that mirror pops up so that the light, the image, can come through that and either hit the sensor when we're talking about digital cameras or hit the film when we're talking about film cameras. So let me show you real quick. I'm going to use the bulb setting, which the bulb setting will let you hold down the shutter and keep the shutter open as long as you want until you release. So let's go ahead and do that. And okay, sorry, there we go. All right, and you can see now that that mirror has popped up, and usually there would be, if I was taking a photo, there would be film back there that the image would hit. Now for digital cameras, instead of film, there's an image sensor there. And then when I let go, you could see that that mirror snapped back down. All right. Okay, so this is controlling how we capture motion. So if there's motion in your image, you want to ask yourself, do you want to freeze the motion, or do you want to show the motion or show the path of motion? Okay, so shutter speed is also controlling how long the light that is coming through the lens is hitting the sensor or film. So shutter speed is measured in fractions of a second. So if my shutter speed is 1/60, then I would say it's 1/60th of a second. And so this literally means that if you take 1 second and divide it up into 60 pieces, then the shutter would only be open for one of those 60 pieces, so 1/60th of a second. Now, shutter speed is usually, a longer shutter speed is usually required for really low light situations, like at night. So we usually try to stay pretty fast, but there's situations where you might need to have your shutter speed be minutes, hours. I've even heard of some photographers rigging up special cameras to do days-long photography. Now, one of the types of photography that you would use, like a 5 minutes long exposure, would be especially with astrophotography. When you're out at night trying to get photos of like the Milky Way or stars or whatever, you go for a longer exposure. But that will also give you light trails of the stars as they're moving. Well, as the Earth is moving and they're moving, everything's moving, right? So anyways, moving on. A fast shutter speed will freeze motion, as I've said, and I'm going to continue to say that over and over again because I want it to get stuck in your head. So a fast shutter speed will freeze motion. Some examples of a fast shutter speed is like 1/1000th of a second, 1/2000th of a second, 1/4000th of a second. So when you're seeing photos of like a dancer in midair, that's usually a really fast shutter speed. A slow shutter speed will show the motion. Some examples of this are 1/15th of a second, 1 full second. So whenever you see this little quotation mark next to a number when we're talking about shutter speed, that stands for a second long. 30 seconds, these are all different options. So something that's really important to understand though is that what's considered slow and fast relates to how fast or slow the motion is of your subject. So you know, if I'm at a NASCAR race and I try to take a photo of the cars going by, I might need to be at 4,000th of a second to freeze it, right? But if I was photographing a cat slowly walking, I would definitely not need a 4,000th of a second to freeze it in motion. I would need a slower shutter speed. And then the same for slow shutter speeds. Let's say if I'm photographing cars driving down Blackstone, if one car is only going 30 miles an hour, the motion blur I get for that car is going to be different than a car that's driving 60 miles an hour, okay? Shouldn't be driving 60 miles an hour on Blackstone, but you know, people do it. So anyways, so yeah, it's important to consider that. So there's not a, you know, one size fits all type of setting. I can't tell you that every time you photograph a cat, you're going to use 1/200th of a second to freeze it in motion. It just depends on how fast that cat is moving. So in general, you want to use a tripod if you're using a shutter speed that's slower than 1/125th of a second. Now, some people will disagree. Some people will say 1/60th of a second is fine. There's some cameras that have image, well, it's not cameras, it's actually on the lens, has image stabilization built in. And I've read reviews where people say that they can get a nice image at 1/15th of a second. So it kind of depends on your lens. It depends on how steady you are, because if you move just a tiny bit in that those fractions of seconds, it can pick it up. So yeah, there's all kinds of considerations, but in general, you want to use a tripod if it's slower than around 1/25th of a second, or at least start thinking of using a tripod or a stable surface. Sometimes you can find a nice stable surface to set your camera up on. So for example, with this image, this was created using a long shutter speed or a slow shutter speed. And I know this because, well, first of all, the model was staying completely still. You can see that the tip of her nose and her lips are nice and in focus. So she was still during this exposure. And all of these lines going on are light trails. So they use some type of tool. I'm thinking it was one of those little like fiber optic toy things. I don't know if you guys remember, if you ever saw them before, but they had a handle and a bunch of little like it looked like pieces of plastic coming out, and at the end of each plastic piece there was a little light. I'm thinking this is what they might have used, because as they're sweeping that around, it's capturing the motion or the trails of those lights as they're moving around the model. So this is pretty cool. If you're liking this image, I would definitely say look up some light photography or light trail photography. There's really some amazing stuff being created out there. All right, so let's keep moving on. All right, so shutter speed, again, determines how motion is captured. Freezing motion with a fast shutter speed. So freeze, fast, fast, freeze. Try to get that in your head. You can show motion with slow shutter speed, show, slow, slow, show. Get that in your head. And here's another example. So, and this is kind of nice for showing, like, capturing the trail or the path of movement. So this one is Frozen, right? And in this example, we're seeing the path of movement from here to here. But in this example, with the slower shutter speed, we're seeing the path of movement from here all the way to here. Okay, so here's a little chart that kind of puts all this together into one place. So on this side, we have a blurry figure. This side, we have a sharp figure. This side is 1 second. So that's a slow shutter speed. This side is 1/2000th, a fast shutter speed. With the slow shutter speed, we're allowing in more light. Just think, you know, if you're letting it in for a second, you're going light. And then 1/2000th of a second, it's like light. So, yeah, you're letting in more light with a longer or slower shutter speed. And you will get motion blur. And here's another important thing to know is camera shake. So camera shake is different from motion blur. Motion blur is the blur of your subject moving, which is what we're trying to do. Camera shake is when if you're trying to hold your camera, or sometimes on a tripod if you accidentally hit it or it's windy, and the camera is slightly shaking during that exposure time, then everything will be out of focus in your image. Whereas with motion blur, with the same image, if there was no camera shake, only the motion would be blurred while like the background or the foreground elements or whatever would be in focus. And here's another, reminder, tripod needed the slower you get, and handheld is easily done here. Now there's also some considerations for this when it comes to long lenses, but we'll get into that later. Okay, so finally, let's go back to Camera Sim for just a sec. And we're going to do the same thing I did with the aperture. So here we have our image, and I'm going to switch to manual mode. And so right now, everything, all the settings are in balance. So I'm going to go ahead and snap a photo. We have a good exposure. There's enough light coming in. We're doing good here. Now, if I only change the shutter speed and nothing else, it's going to change how much light is coming in or how much light is not coming in. So if I go to the fastest shutter speed possible, okay, 1/4000th of a second on here. Now I'm letting in, can you guys think of it? If I'm 1/4000th of a second is letting in more or less light? Okay, it's gonna be, I'm letting in less light, super fast. So light, instead of light, it's light. So let's take a photo, if it'll stay. All right, there is so little light coming in that we got no photo. It's completely black. So this is something to think about when you're out photographing and you start playing with all these different settings. Are you letting in enough light or not? Let's go back, and now let's go down to 1 second. And so now you can guess what's going to happen. I'm letting in too much light, and we're probably going to get a completely white exposure. All right, yeah, I was right. So there is not way too much light coming in, so we are overexposing, and that's not what we're trying to do. But it's just a good exercise to know this. All right, so that's it for shutter speed. The next video, we're going to be talking about ISO.